Because what you don't know about energy can kill you. Here's Alex Epstein.
Welcome to Power Hour. Sitting in for Alex Epstein this week, I'm Don Watkins, Director of Education at the Center for Industrial Progress, and with me is CIP's Head of Research, Stefan Henna. Hey, Stefan.
Hey, Don.
All right, well, let's jump right in. The Trump administration announced that it's going to change the way the Endangered Species Act is applied. So the administration's alterations don't actually change the law, but they do change how the government is going to enforce it. And the new rules are designed to make it easier to remove a species from the endangerment list and lower protections for threatened species, that is the classification one step below endangered. Now, as a general view, I think that preserving species can be a worthy goal, but it should be from the perspective of human flourishing. That is this species valuable to us directly or indirectly, and how valuable? And just by indirectly, I have in mind that, we might not directly benefit from it as food or something like that, but it might be vital to a particular habitat that that there's other valuable things that we get from it. But the Endangered Species Act explicitly prevents us from asking those kinds of questions. That is, from looking at it from a human perspective. The whole idea is that we are supposed to preserve species, whatever the level of sacrifice required from us, regardless of the costs. And that is, it's literally true. So that under current law, to make a determination about whether a species belongs on the endangerment list and therefore gets all kinds of different protections, it has to be made without reference, I'm quoting, to possible economic or other impacts of determination. Now, that is an insane provision. Like, if you think about what a cost means, a cost has a major impact on human life. That is, if you deprive a community of $1 billion, people will die sooner. And so what this really means is that the life of an endangered spider or whatever is worth more than any number of human lives and any amount of human happiness. And as I mentioned, Trump is not changing the law. They have not said that, no, now we're going to start taking into account costs, which would require an act from Congress. It's merely disclosing the cost to the public. It's saying that, all right, this is going to have this much of a financial impact on you. And that seems reasonable, right? Like, if we are the ones who have delegated to the government saying, yeah, we want to preserve species, it seems that being informed about, well, what are the trade-offs involved in that is the least that could be done. But environmentalists, unsurprisingly, are complaining. The way the New York Times puts it is that change conservation groups fear opens the door to business interests coming into discussions of whether a species should be protected. And to put that as business interests is really interesting, because, like, what is a business interest? It's just the ability to produce the wealth that human beings need to flourish. And so what they're really objecting to is not business interests, but human interests. And if you want to see in vivid detail what this really means in practice, we could go through stories of the kinds of development projects that are shut down, not to protect something that, like, everybody's really invested in, like bald eagles or polar bears, but over, like, literally bugs, spiders, and animals that you've never heard of and wouldn't care about if you did hear about them. But I'm not even more, I think, illuminating than that is the Wall Street Journal had an editorial recently that really drives this framework of thinking about species preservation home. So earlier this year, there is a rat infestation in downtown Los Angeles near a homeless encampment, and it led to an outbreak of typhus. And in fact, cases of the flea-borne disease had more than doubled since 2012. Now, California's EPA had a pretty sensible response, which is they put out rat poison. But environmentalists, of course, complained. And why do they complain? Because it would harm the species that prey on rats. And so now there's actually Democrats in California who are moving to ban what are called second generation rodenticides that are more potent than earlier poisons. And the reason the reason that people are interested in this more potent form of poison is because the old ones that won't be banned, rats have started to develop an immunity to it. And so this is a finding that went along, or an analysis that went along with this bill. It said predatory species such as raptors, bobcats, and foxes regularly consume rodents as part of their diet. Poison rodents also become more lethargic and exhibit abnormal behavior, but data are less conclusive in pointing to anticoagulant rodenticides as the specific cause of death in these animals. So in other words, it's saying, well, we're not really sure that these poisons are hurting these predator species, but what we do know is that rodents are carrying diseases that are really hurting Californians. But to environmentalists, that does not matter because we cannot consider the cost to human beings. Any thoughts on this, Stefan?
Yeah, I found the Endangered Species Act really an evil piece of legislation back a couple of years when I first encountered the actual text. And it has a lot of illogical things to it. And one of the things that I have encountered is that this legislation requires the federal government to protect species no matter why they are endangered. So if like dinosaurs were around and they were about to go extinct naturally, we would have to protect them with taxpayer money. So there's for no reason any animal could ever die if we take this literally. So this is a very illogical piece of legislation. And of course, this new interpretation or this guidance rule is not going to change the actual Endangered Species Act. So yeah, it's an uphill battle, and we see this all across the world. So in Europe, they banned these pesticides called neonicotinoids, which allegedly had endangered bee species. And it turned out it wasn't actually a real danger to the honeybees in Europe, but nevertheless, these pesticides were banned by the European Union. So it's a really good tool for obstructionist Greens to ban all kinds of technologies that are actually life-saving.
Stefan, what's your first story?
I have a similar story about a new guidance rule by the Trump administration for Section 401 of the Clean Water Act. And this section gives states and certain tribes the authority to review potential water impacts of projects like pipelines and export terminals and so on before the federal government can give permission to these projects. And so the background is executive order by President Trump from April, which wanted to promote and accelerate these kinds of projects. And EPA now, as a result of that, has proposed the new guiding rule. And the background is that several states have abused this kind of sort of permission veto right to block projects that didn't comply with their own political agenda, even when the water quality concerns were actually small. So, two examples here. New York State has blocked a natural gas pipeline coming in from Pennsylvania recently. And presidential candidate Jay Inslee, when he was governor of Washington State, used the Clean Water Act to block a proposed coal export terminal. And so the new guidance rule requires this permission process to issue a permission no later than 1 year after the application, which is sort of limiting the ability of state governments to stall projects they don't like. Think about Keystone XL, the now infamous pipeline project that is, I don't know if it's a record, but it's 11 years and counting for this to be built from Canada to the refineries in Texas. And it also will limit the scope of the state review to actual water impacts and not, have some side issues in there. And so it's already visible that this will likely be contested in court because, of course, certain state governments like that of New York and California and elsewhere they do want to be able to block projects they don't like pipelines and other energy infrastructure. And so it can be seen as a small victory within the framework, but this doesn't fix the general problem. One is the general anti-development, not in my backyard sentiment that is also present in large parts of the general population. And it's also not going to change the actual law. So you can expect the next administration, which is not as friendly to infrastructure project as the Trump administration, you know, going 2 steps back after this one small step forward.
Yeah, I mean, generally, I think people are not worried by any single thing like this particular pipeline is being stopped. It just doesn't seem that big a deal. And that's a big problem if you want to stop this trend of infrastructure and energy projects being interfered with. And so if you think, well, what do people get upset about? Because one thing that we've cataloged on this podcast is they get upset about every blessed, particle of CO2 that goes into the air. And the the reason for that is that it's seen as part of a larger narrative, that anytime you have this narrative that something like CO2 is destroying the planet, then any contribution to that is seen as urgent and important. And I think that's why what you really need in order to shift the tide on something like this is that people start hearing constantly about a genuine crisis that we face, which is energy deprivation. That is, we're pushing ourselves towards a crisis because of the lack of reliable energy and infrastructure to reliably deliver reliable energy. And that has the potential. And in some places, I think we're frighteningly close to realizing that potential of being faced with blackouts and extreme high prices to avoid blackouts. And if people were genuinely frightened by that, then you could see a real movement here where each one of these cases would be seen as like, you are contributing to energy deprivation and that has to be stopped. And so while I'm certainly happy to see these marginal improvements in the law, I definitely think that on their own they cannot accomplish a great deal. I want to talk about the latest front in the climate debate, and that is the topic of meat. So, following the latest IPCC report, Climate Change in Land, I certainly saw an explosion of articles recommending that people eat less meat or even cut it out entirely. And you know that as soon as something is seen as contributing to climate change, there's going to be calls not just for people to voluntarily stop doing it, but to restrict and ban it. And it turns out that Germany, in fact, is considering a meat tax, or at least what it's considering doing is, whereas for most foods, they're taxed at a lower rate of 7% because they're considered, how would you put it, Stefan, like a vital need or something like that?
Yeah, the government thinks basic needs shouldn't be taxed as highly as others.
Right. But now we have lawmakers talking about raising it to the general VAT level of 19%. And the justification of this is supposed to be that it will decrease the nation's consumption of meat, which will help animals and help the climate. And in fact, Germany is not the only country exploring the idea of a meat tax. You have at least Denmark and Sweden looking into it. And Bjorn Lomborg has a piece in the Wall Street Journal where he clarified some of the factual issues surrounding meat. And basically, what it boils down to is that meat and everything that goes into creating it is a very minor part of climate emissions, particularly once you take into account the fact that it's not like people just stop eating meat and they don't do anything else. They start making other purchasing decisions. And so if you look at kind of the net reduction from eliminating meat for a person, that basically their emissions are reduced by 2%. So it's not that big a win. And I think that's important in that, Like if you're going to put your energy behind, we're going to pass this law that would massively inconvenience a lot of people, and in particular inconvenience them in the pursuit of their diet, then you would think, well, maybe this should actually have an impact on the problem we say we're going to try to solve. But I think there's a wider issue here, which is just how stunningly unconcerned people are with freedom. Like that is not even part of the debate. It's simply like this has a climate impact, so of course the government should discourage or even ban it. And we should all celebrate that. And if your whole standard of value is anything that increases CO2 is bad and open game for government to regulate, I mean, that framework is totalitarian. It's that you have the right to no single choice that impacts the climate. And since every choice you make impacts the climate, at least insofar as it uses energy, this means that every choice should be game for government to control and say like, well, this impacts climate and so you can't do it, or at least the government has the right to judge, well, do we really think that, the public interest justifies this use of CO2? Because presumably we're still allowed to exhale. And underneath that is just a real contempt, I think, for human choice. That is like people choose to eat meat for a reason, whether taste or health or some combination of both. And there's no concern that like, well, that by taking away that choice from people or by artificially penalizing that choice, this could be really bad for them, because it's the experts know best. And we've judged apparently that it's not actually good to eat meat. And B, we aren't really concerned with human flourishing anyway. And so what I want to highlight here is that the kind of policies directed against climate, it's not just that they're not valuing human flourishing, it's that they're not valuing it at the deepest level, which is to flourish is exercising thought and judgment about what's best for your life. And what the whole climate restrictions come from is this perspective that says, no, you shouldn't be free to exercise that kind of judgment and choice, that we are going to dictate what you're allowed to do. And our justification for doing it is the idea that you don't have the right to impact climate. Stefan, as somebody who lives in Germany and presumably eats the occasional meat product, what's your opinion on this?
Yeah, so you can see the tyrannical nature of this in the level of micromanagement. So not only is the government going to sort of forcefully reduce your greenhouse gas emissions, but it's actually deciding how you do this in great detail, like what your diet will be, right? So normally, as a utilitarian economist, you would have something like, oh, we need to reduce CO2 overall, and it's we shouldn't like pick the technologies how to achieve that. We should let innovators and markets decide like what's the best way to do that. But the government then, in addition to something like a CO2 tax, will also try to micromanage human behavior, consumer behavior, and this is very concerning. In addition to the overall nature of this forced CO2 reduction, but so it's true that for our CO2 budget, as people living in the developed world, it's not that relevant to not eat meat overall. But think about the implications just the developing world has. So the vast majority of future emissions will likely come from places like India and China and other developing countries, where literally hundreds and hundreds of millions of people, like multiple times the population of the United States or the European Union, actually are waiting to enter the global middle class and consume far more goods than they do right now. So it's sort of, it's really, we are arguing about things that don't make a huge difference in our context. But since CO2 emissions are a global context, it totally makes no sense to start there with micromanaging human diet in Germany or Denmark, of all places, like very small populations, already very rich people. And the developing world will require a lot of energy. And if we don't have an alternative to fossil fuels, then actually they will have to get that from fossil fuels, because nothing is more unhealthy than not having energy.
Yeah, well, I mean, it doesn't make sense to do this if your concern is really making an impact on climate. But if your real concern is to stop people from impacting nature, well, then it makes perfect sense, right? Because the climate is just a justification for restricting people's freedom to impact nature. And I mean, nothing impacts nature more directly than eating it. All right, Stefan, what's your next story?
Okay, so I want to talk about the green utopia that we are sold in mainstream media and advocate narratives. So when we talk about the future of energy, we often hear, words like clean energy, sustainability, renewables, and so on. And this language is actually carefully designed to imply that it will be a smooth ride, switching from, the dirty fossil fuels and nuclear, the conventional energy systems, to, these allegedly superior renewables, which is mostly solar and wind, of course. And if this sounds too good to be true, it actually is. This is selling us a utopia instead of giving us a grasp of what this process would actually mean, and what kind of human suffering we need to endure to actually accomplish that. So it's presented as a superior alternative that has no real cost. We're just switching from a inferior to a superior technology, and we are better off actually. And the case in point I just came across today, which is meteorologist and climate alarmist Eric Holthaus, who is also a frequent contributor to GRISP, which is a publication that deals in these alarmist climate narratives. And he, on Twitter, he said the following. He was actually reacting to signs of a slowing economy. So he said, friendly reminder that comprehensive climate legislation, a radical restructuring of society in order to save our planet's habitability, is the best economic stimulus package we could ever hope for. So, okay, we'll just invest in green technology, of course, and then we will be actually better off. And we see this a lot in proposals like the Green New Deal and other narratives. And for those who don't find the historical evidence sufficient, since at least the mid-19th century, thanks to the French economist Frédéric Bastiat, we know that smashing your working capital doesn't actually make you richer. But to drive home this point, I want to point everyone to the work of Mark Mills, who was a former Power Hour guest and is a fellow at the Manhattan Institute. And he has an article in the Wall Street Journal that's called "If You Want Renewable Energy, Get Ready to Dig." And so this is meant to emphasize that all of these new technologies like solar and wind and battery technology and so on, they require some real work, and they have their own downsides. And, so I just want to read a couple of quotes from this article to emphasize this. And I want everyone to keep in mind one of my favorite themes when we talk about these energy transitions to new energy technologies. And this is the magnitude of the problem. That's a very important point here. So the first quote is from Mark Mills is, "The International Renewable Energy Agency calculates that solar goals for 2050, consistent with the Paris Accords, will result in old panel disposal constituting more than double the tonnage of all today's global plastic waste." So this is a lot of material, of course, that needs to be dealt with. The second quote is, "A single electric car battery weighs about 1,000 pounds. Fabricating one requires digging up, moving, and processing more than 500,000 pounds of raw materials somewhere on the planet." So again, the magnitude of the problem. This is a lot of material that has to be digged out of the ground. The next quote is, "World demand for rare earth elements, which aren't rare but are rarely mined in America, will rise 300 to 1,000% by 2050 to meet the Paris Green goals. If electric vehicles replace conventional cars, demand for cobalt and lithium will rise more than 20-fold. That doesn't count batteries to back up wind and solar grids. So battery electric cars will again require a lot of digging, and a lot of material needs to be moved and processed. This is why battery electric cars actually have a significant CO2 footprint, because the manufacturing is so demanding in resources. And the final quote from the article: building enough wind turbines to supply half the world's electricity would require nearly 2 billion tons of coal to produce the concrete and steel, along with 2 billion barrels of oil to make the composite blades. More than 90% of the world's solar panels are built in Asia on coal-heavy electric grids. So this shows in very physical terms what these renewables and the clean technology and so on actually requires. Just like fossil fuels and nuclear power and so on, everything requires a lot of human industry and processes that have some kind of footprint. And actually, all of these technologies, from solar panels to wind turbines to batteries, they require fossil fuels to be as quote-unquote affordable as they are right now. So if you would take this away and would force everyone to build a wind turbine with a wind turbine and a battery with a wind turbine, that would actually escalate the cost. And so this would necessarily impoverish hundreds of millions and keep billions of humans in their current state of poverty or worse. So instead of this boon and stimulus to the economy, this is just a friendly reminder that you cannot have a free lunch. It's going to be painful if we are destroying our working capital as is and replace it with an inferior quote-unquote alternative. This will be very problematic. And just like the Soviet utopia that promised a free and prosperous society miserably failed, this is also the future of this green utopia that we're talking. And it's actually very disingenuous, to say the least, to promote this as some kind of better deal. It's just, markets fail and don't find the best solution, and fossil fuels are chosen for some arbitrary reason, and we would actually be better off just switching to solar. And, this is a narrative that prevails, but it's actually false and very dangerous to the future of humans.
Yeah, I think it's helpful to take really seriously this idea that they're utopian and get at what exactly that means. So one of the things that is true virtually across the board of utopian thinkers is that they never spend that much time explaining exactly how their utopia is going to work. So if you take the communists, they wrote volume after volume, but it was almost all about what was wrong and evil about capitalism. It was not about how communism is going to work. Like, how are we going to decide what to produce and in what quantities, and what reason do we have to think that there's going to be innovation, and what kind of incentives are we creating, and what historical evidence do we have that this has ever worked? And, it's basically just capitalism is bad, get rid of capitalism, and then we'll worry about how our system is going to work later. And then it does get put into practice, and later comes, and they look around and you get nothing like what they promised. So it's this green utopia, but the green utopia is a bunch of mining and a bunch of blackouts. It is the complete opposite of this kind of fantasy they created. But they actually, in fact, got what they were really after, because what they're really after is not this utopia of communism or this green utopia, but to smash capitalism and to smash industrialization. And so what you're seeing here is the fact that utopias are actually rationalizations for destruction, whether it's capitalism or fossil fuels. It's, this is bad compared to my fantasy, but you're not really after a fantasy. It's you're tearing down something good and something real, but you want to be able to position yourself to others and think of yourself as an idealist. And you can contrast that with people who you might mistake for utopians, but genuine idealists. And that's, the founding fathers of this country, where they were profoundly concerned with what positively are we creating? How will it work? What is the evidence of history it's going to work? What are all the ways it could go wrong? And what is the best possible system that is actually achievable? And the green movement is not at all idealistic in that sense. It's utopian in the sense that the communists were utopian, which is just a different way of saying that it's actually nihilistic. So my next story goes to a report from the American Psychological Association, which put out a press release saying that climate skeptics are more likely to believe climate claims if they are first reminded of fields of science that they trust. And so there have been a lot of experiments like this, but just to give you some details on what this one was. So researchers went out and they surveyed 700 participants. And so half of the participants were giving surveys that asked questions just generally about people's belief in science, like how credible is the medical data that germs are a primary cause of disease. And then they were asked about their belief in climate science. So it's, how certain are you that global warming explains many of the new weather patterns we are seeing today? And then the other half was just asked about their belief in climate science. And then people reported how they classified themselves politically. And so the researchers say that it turns out conservatives reported a greater belief in climate science if they were asked questions first about their belief in other areas of science. And one of the researchers kind of described what was going on this way. For climate skeptics, it likely became awkward to report on our surveys that they believed in science while at the same time denying the findings of climate science. That dissonance led many to adjust beliefs to show greater support for the existence of climate change. And he went on to say it's exciting to know that in the real world settings, we might be able to have more productive climate conversations by starting from a place of common belief. And I think that there's something right about this. That is, a conversation to be constructive should start from a place of common belief. But what's going on here is starting from a place of common belief and then a non sequitur to accepting a conclusion without evidence. So if you think about the nature of the argument, it's science got something right here, so science must have gotten something right in this completely different branch. Well, that doesn't follow at all. That what we should really be doing if we're trying to persuade is start from a common goal and a common method so that we can look at the actual evidence and reach a legitimate understanding of what is true and false. So another way to put it is the way that we think about having constructive conversations and framing conversations at CIP is what we're really doing is sharing the framework that convinced us, that persuaded us of our position with another person, because the proper framework is common sense, even though it's not common practice. So if that you can get somebody's commitment to have as their goal to decide what will best support human flourishing, and then a commitment to look at the evidence and look at the alternatives in a non-biased and precise way, then you can have a really productive conversation because you are all headed in the same direction. But what we're seeing here is not real persuasion by sharing the method that helped you reach clarity. It's really manipulation. It is finding it's finding psychological tricks that will make it more likely people will blindly accept your conclusion. So, this happens in marketing all the time. They've done studies where, they'd have somebody march through a neighborhood, knock on doors and say, "Do you consider yourself a charitable person?" And the person says, "Oh, yes, I do." And then the next day they send somebody else to say, "Hey, will you donate this to this charity?" And what they find is that, a significant number more people donate to charity after they've already activated in their mind the idea that, yeah, I'm a charitable person. And this is that same kind of manipulation. But one problem with it, there's several problems. One is you can just, do it the other way. It's like, hey, when's the last time that scientists got something completely wrong, like the so-called nutrition triangle? And then you can ask about climate science. More importantly is because it's not based on actually providing people with genuine clarity, I would guess with almost 100% certainty that this is not an enduring change. And if you want enduring change, people have to have enduring reasons. That is, they have to actually see first-handedly for themselves the evidence for the claim. And so long as people are trying to figure out ways to persuade on climate that doesn't involve actually providing people with clarity, I think you're not going to get anywhere. And if you do get anywhere, it is purely by propaganda and manipulation. And I think that it's good that people are concerned with this problem of how do we have more productive conversations about these crucial, complex issues. But I would like to see those arguments or those discussions happen in a way that allow us to make better decisions, not ways that just get people to buy into our dogma. So, Stefan, any thoughts on you on this kind of experiment or these kinds of studies?
Yeah, so it's interesting that they start with saying, okay, a productive conversation is where you first of all agree with my predetermined conclusions, and then we can start this conversation from there. So I have a little anecdote from Germany again, where framing got sort of a bad reputation in the public discussion because some state-sponsored media had revealed that it had a framing handbook, and in this handbook they had all kinds of guidance how to deal with certain topics and things. And one of the examples was like how to deal with people who don't want to pay the government, the state media fee. And they would call them then free riders because this is a public service. And people just who don't want to pay the fee, to be fed this state media news, they would just be free riders. So they were parasitic in a sense, right? So a very negative thing. And this kind of thing. So you see there's a tendency for people to see this as an opportunity to, work some psychological tricks and manipulate the outcome of a conversation, as where a proper framework for conversation is to make certain things clear, like a proper goal. What do we want to achieve? What is our common moral goal for any action that we want to take in the future? And what's the proper process to think these things through and work towards it? So framing is often used as a terminology to describe something really bad, which is more of the manipulative side, whereas framing as we understand it is to provide a clear or clarity, and also set up the conversation on the right track so that people can gain clarity by discussing issues. And this is not at all the case. So you can see in the survey, they didn't provide any additional information about any of the facts about climate or how to think about this. They just sort of made a sleight of hand, manipulating people into, admitting that they don't know a lot about this, and then they bow to authority as, given to them by the survey creators.
Yeah, I think that's a really important point to stress, though, is that like a framework, the reason to be concerned with framework is not because this is a really clever manipulation tactic, but it's that we have a framework, that it's there whether we know it or not. Every thought process, every conversation has a framework. It has certain methods, it has certain assumptions about cause and effect, and it has certain values. And if you don't make those explicit, if you don't bring those to the forefront, then you don't know what you're counting on. You can't self-consciously examine and apply them, and that leads to the kind of chaos that we see all around us. So the whole goal is just to make explicit something that's there already, and then be self-conscious about it and make sure that our framework is solid rather than it's one that will collapse. Stefan, why don't we do one more story?
Okay, so I recently saw a YouTube video of Dave Jones from the EEV blog, which deals with technology, electronics, and so on. And he had another update on something that went viral some years ago, which is solar roads. And the basic idea here is that, we could use our road infrastructure also as a power generation infrastructure. In addition to facilitating our traffic, we just combine roads with solar panels, and then we have roads that actually produce energy. And so there are a couple of pilot projects on the international stage, and some of them failed spectacularly already. So a 2016 project in Normandy, France, for example, funded by the Ministry of the Environment, paved a kilometer of road with solar cells that were specifically developed for this process. As one news report puts it, the solar panels were unable to withstand the wear and tear caused by tractors and thunderstorms, became covered by leaf mold, and created too much noise for local residents, which meant that the speed limit had to be reduced to 70 kilometers per hour. And also the project generated less electric energy than it was hoped at the start. And then there are solar bike pathways in the Netherlands, some of which needed frequent repair, and a Chinese solar highway also failed. At first they thought some of the solar panels were stolen by thieves, but actually the investigation showed that they were just grinded to dust. So they found the small particles of solar panels where the road should be. And so you could think, okay, there's something going wrong here. This is a new technology, and a pilot project failed. But solar roads are such a bad investment, and you can immediately see this. You don't even need a pilot project. And Dave Jones and others have made sophisticated calculations on why this is a bad idea. But just think about this in very basic layman terms. So first of all, the road is a very bad surface to put a solar panel on. It cannot be tilted towards the sun, which would be optimal for a solar panel, right? It has a lot of dirt on it, so the solar panel, by the nature of the road, cannot have as much sunlight on it as it should. And then, of course, the surface of the road needs to be very sturdy. There's heavy-duty trucks running over it, and so there's a lot of wear on the road pavement. And standard road pavement already gets destroyed over time by the heavy-duty traffic on it. And of course, if you build some electronics into it, this is even worse. And then, of course, the cost of doing that, right? Combining the road with a solar panel, you need a special pavement that on one hand is very sturdy, on the other hand, it also needs to be transparent, right? So the sunlight can reach the actual solar panel below the surface. And so this is a really horrible idea because it needlessly combines the sort of dumbest way to install a solar panel with the dumbest way to build a road. And so you get all the worst out of two bad worlds. And this doesn't require a pilot project. So why do governments invest in that? And I think it's because it's a green fashion. It's like roads and traffic and emissions and so on are seen as bad, and solar energy is seen as good. So they combine the two, and then they pretend this is some kind of sustainable green version of the bad road. And of course, they can spend taxpayer money on it, and they will never be held accountable for that. But on the broader perspective, every time some proposal like the Green New Deal or other advocacy pieces talk about vaguely green investments, I think about this kind of project. This is like, there is no technology to replace fossil fuels at this point. Maybe nuclear in the future if we manage to unleash it, but it's not there yet, and it will take time to get it there, if ever. And so when people vaguely talk about green investments and they don't have a concrete plan, I think this is a kind of project we need to think about. It will be a spectacular failure, and gobble up a lot of taxpayer money with very little effect.
Yeah, I mean, one way I think about it, I mean, I definitely agree there's kind of a mania element to it, but there's also a category of investments that I think of as ideological investments. So, I run in free market circles, and there's kind of a subculture in this world of gold bugs. And I don't mean necessarily people who are for the gold standard, which I think has a very strong argument for it, or at least something like a gold standard. But there's these people who just say that, like, constantly, oh, you have to be investing in gold, you have to be investing in gold. And like ideological investments like these, they inevitably have reasons why it's supposedly brilliant. And look, sometimes they can be right, at least temporarily. A lot of the early investors in Bitcoin were libertarians who supported it for political reasons. But they're often not thinking about it as an investment. They're not thinking about it objectively. There's just this dogma that gold is good or renewables are good, or some kind of digital currency not issued by the government is good, and it can lead to really bad decision making. And I mean, at least with gold, it's a value versus, like, I don't even know what the analogy would be for a road. I mean, it'd be like a form of Bitcoin that just like ate up your bank account or something. Like it's, you think, wow, something that just destroys my bank account is probably not a good investment. But that you should just be very wary of, even if you think your ideology is true, of, am I seizing on this as a good idea because it actually makes sense on its own terms, or am I seizing on it as an idea because it fits what the kind of moral or political view that I have, or one that happens to be trendy and popular? Because the other way to look at this is that, it's not the people who start businesses like these, some of them may be sincere, others, this is just their get rich quick. Like, the 400th person who comes out with their, keto system diet, you have to be suspicious of. But, that said, I think it's the thing that makes this really bad is that these are often financed and promoted by the government, so that, if some gold bug invests a bunch of money in gold and it turns out to be a bad investment, he pays the price. But when we have the government, quote, invest in these things, we all pay the price. That's it for this week. If you have any questions, comments, love mail, or hate mail, email me, Don Watkins, at don@industrialprogress.net. And if you have any interest in a speech by Alex or anyone else from our team, we've got a lineup of great speakers at different price points. So email me at don@industrialprogress.net. And if you have any high-stakes messaging projects that you'd like to consider working with us on, email me and we can set up a quick 15-minute call to go over what your goals are and how we might be able to help. I want to remind everybody that Alex's Prager University video on the Green New Deal called "What's the Deal with the Green New Deal" is out there. It's racked up over 2.3 million views already, but I'd like to see that number have an extra 0 on it. So go on to YouTube, search for Alex Epstein Green New Deal, and be sure to share it with anybody in your network. As always, you can subscribe to our newsletter to keep up with the latest from the Center for Industrial Progress at alexepsteinlist.com. And we will be back next week with more topics. Until then, I'm Don Watkins with Stefan Henna, and this has been Power Hour.
Power Hour. Life, liberty, and the pursuit of energy. Power Hour. The antidote to shallow thinking about energy issues.